I'm the Social Justice Program Specialist here at YWCA Greater Green Bay, and we are so glad that you were able to join us today for our Stand Against Racism and in our mission to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. So thank you all so much out there in the universe for joining us today, and to our panelists for joining us today. So first we have Noel Halverson from NeighborWorks Green Bay. Noel is serving the organization since October 2000. He has extensive experience in resident leadership, asset management, housing, and community development. Noel has led the acquisition, renovation, and development of 296 units of housing and 50,000 square feet of commercial space. During his tenure, NeighborWorks Green Bay has counseled more than 13,500 area households and helped more than 3,500 families to purchase homes. Noel has led the agency to ever greater self-sufficiency, realizing more than 60% of total revenue from earned income. Noel is active in other organizations, including Green Bay Neighborhoods, the East Central Wisconsin Gappers Network, and the NeighborWorks Alliance of Wisconsin. He serves as a board member and internal policy committee chair of the National NeighborWorks Association and is a member of the NeighborWorks America Advisory Council and chair of the NeighborWorks America Technical Advisory Committee. Noel, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about why you said yes to joining us today?
Well, thank you. Well, number one, because I was asked, right? People show up because they're asked, and I think this is an interesting series and a timely one, and I think that I'm interested in all things housing, and there's certainly some dynamics that go on around race and ethnicity and housing traditionally. And there's some aspects that need to be more explored than they have been perhaps by our community, and so that's why I said yes, because this is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've worked in local government planning or housing development for my whole career, and this is core business for me.
Thanks so much for being here. So next we have Erica Sanders. She's the Director of Program Services for the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council. Ms. Sanders has been employed with MMFHC since 1998 and supervises its statewide outreach and education program, ensuring that comprehensive fair housing information is available to residents of Wisconsin. Ms. Sanders conducts presentations to housing consumers, social service agencies, community and faith-based organizations, and provides fair housing training to owners and managers of rental housing. She holds degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Oberlin College. The purpose of the Fair Housing Council is to promote fair housing throughout the state of Wisconsin by combating illegal housing discrimination and by creating and maintaining racially and economically integrated housing patterns. Erica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here because racial discrimination in the housing market, whether it's in sales or rental or even homeowners insurance or lending, remains a serious problem across the country and here in Wisconsin. And until we address that, we're not going to get at a lot of other racial disparities in wealth, in healthcare, in education, and so forth. So I'm really grateful to the YWCA for convening this group to talk about real practical ways we can fight for housing justice based on race.
Thank you. Next, we have John Shelton. John is Associate Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where he teaches courses about American politics, labor, and education. He's the author of Teacher Strike, Public Education, and the Making of the New American Political Order. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for being here today. I said yes to this basically because Ahmad suggested that I come and do this, and basically if Ahmad suggests that I do something, I just do it. So don't abuse that power, by the way. But no, this is obviously a really important topic. And as you can already see, for those of you who are listening to this, we have a ton of expertise on contemporary housing policy and where things are. My expertise is really as a historian, and so what I'll try to do is offer some historical context, sort of how we got to this place where, I mean, we've already heard that there are a number of from both Noel and Erica, they've already sort of alluded to this. There's a number of disparities that exist along the lines of race, but also class as well. And so some things that we should be paying attention to, and I think what I can add is some of the historical developments that have really led to this state of affairs, and even beyond that, some of the kind of mythologies that we have about housing and other aspects of economic opportunity, right? I mean, we have these very deep mythologies that there's a free market out there that just runs without any kind of human construction, and so many of our structures were actually built over time by humans, and policy choices that were made, and many of those were racially discriminatory. So we got to understand that to really understand the contemporary political question, and so that's what I'm going to try to add today. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. Speaking of, I have to get back to my email now because one of our participants, Katie, emailed me in the middle of this, and now I lost my questions. So Amy, if you're out there, I am shaming you right now. So speaking of Ahmad, our next panelist is Ahmad Rivera-Wagner. He serves as the community liaison for the mayor of Green Bay, and he was most recently the state policy director for United States Senator Ed Markey. He's held several policy and advocate roles over his career, including the Director of Housing Policy at Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, Program Officer for the Massachusetts Service Alliance, managing an $11 million grant portfolio of AmeriCorps programs, and served as a Springfield City Councilor. As a Springfield City Councilor, he championed an anti-foreclosure ordinance to protect homeowners from predatory banks, stopped a biomass plant that would have posed a long-term public health problem, and expanded access to city services for non-English speakers. During Ahmad's AmeriCorps service, he founded Kids Vote in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where his initiative expanded civic opportunities for marginalized communities, resulting in increasing voting. Ahmad went to undergrad at Bentley University and attended grad school for education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Ahmad, thank you so much for joining us.
I am ecstatic to be here. My yes was one, a long time ago, I actually spoke at the YWCA statewide conference in Madison. And so it just feels like serendipity in a full circle over 10 years. So I look like I'm 12, but I'm much older than that. But one of the things I've learned I'm really passionate about, one is connecting with the people on this panel who I think are brilliant local leaders who bring so much to the table. And I'm just thankful that I can even be on the same plane as them. But two, this is both a personal issue for me. I grew up raised by a single mom who had me at 16. We grew up homeless. I know what the face of government looks like when it can fail families, but I also know that when we do things right, when we create the right policies and practices, that it can change people's lives. And it took someone like me growing up in poverty and homelessness to go working in the halls of power of Congress and here locally. And so I know what we can do at our best moments. And so I'm here to talk about that. And I think what people don't always associate with both economic progress and racial justice is the centering of housing and how you're housed and how you have access to that housing and how that can both determine where you've come from and also determine where you can go, both literally and figuratively. And so I'm here just to be, kind of a cog in the wheel of the conversation to help us make that reality that are just stats and numbers have a human and real lived experience, and how together we can make and change the policies to be more forward thinking and more people focused.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Stand Against Racism is a long-term series here at YWCA Greater Green Bay, and we are grateful to have all of you join us. This year for our Stand Against Racism, we've really split our time between two different topics. So about every other month, we're really focusing in on COVID-19 and the kind of effects that COVID-19 is having on specific racial populations here in the Green Bay area and throughout our country. And then the other half, we're spending really diving into different aspects of systemic racism. And housing is definitely part of that and what we're here to talk about today. So really, we're here today to talk about the kinds of generations of policy and practices that have created housing disparities and continue to strengthen and enforce and perpetuate those kinds of disparities today. So starting with that, let's start with historical factors. What are the kinds of historical factors that have led to housing disparity? John, this seems like maybe your wheelhouse.
Sure, thanks, and I'll try to keep this pretty short. You all don't have the benefit of, or maybe the detriment of having to sit through one of my classes where I talk about this. But I think the first thing to think about when you think about housing is that housing is intimately connected to wealth, right? And wealth is intergenerational. So what really seems on a superficial level, right? People who have money making choices in the marketplace is really the product of hundreds of years of history, right? So I mean, you could take this all the way back to the end of the Civil War, when freedmen and women, who many of whom fought to emancipate themselves during the war, were basically left with no no compensation for the decades of labor that they did to enrich landowners in the South. And in fact, landowners in the South basically had their property rights restored, even though they revolted against the American government in order to preserve slavery, right? So you can I mean, like I said, you can trace it all the way back to that time in which basically freed men and women were acting in the marketplace really from an inequitable position, right? No resources to purchase property. And so, that stuff obviously continues over time, right? Because when families have money to pass on to younger family members, there's an accrual of wealth that takes place. So, it's definitely the case that this didn't just pertain to African Americans, right? I mean, like, you had lots of immigrants come to the United States in the early 19th century from from ethnic backgrounds that we would consider today to be white, right? So like, people from Central Europe, people from Italian Americans and the like, who might have had very little property as well, and found it difficult to participate in the housing market all the way back in the 20th century, right? People listening to this probably think about tenements in northern cities, right, where you have people living in very substandard housing and relying on the landlords who are predominantly interested in making a profit. But there's kind of a moment in the 1930s, and this is a response to the Depression, in which the federal government starts to take some really kind of affirmative actions, and I'm using that word very specifically here, some affirmative actions to help Americans purchase housing. And again, it's a response to the imperative of the Depression, because the housing market basically collapsed. Nobody was buying new houses. So there's a couple of different laws, and I won't go into all of them, but the most important one is in 1934, where a law is passed that essentially allows the federal government to subsidize mortgages. And to subsidize those mortgages, basically what it does is it insures mortgages for private lenders, right? So it gives people the illusion that they're participating in a private marketplace, but these are effectively, again, publicly subsidized mortgages. And I want to just share something here quickly, just to sort of help everybody understand this. Let's see if I can get it here. Oops. So this is a map that this is actually a Homeowners Loan Corporation map from the 1930s, and it's a map of Philadelphia. And effectively what it does is it illustrates the criteria under which the federal government would underwrite these loans. And so even though they weren't, the government wasn't, specifically talking about race, it would only underwrite loans, or primarily underwrite loans, in parts of cities that were white. So this is Philadelphia. You can see the best and desirable housing stock. These are all in white areas of the city, right? The declining areas here, these are yellow. These would have been more sort of like white ethnic neighborhoods. Northern and northeastern Philly are like white working class areas. And then these areas here, these pink areas, these are some white ethnic neighborhoods, but primarily African-American neighborhoods. So basically what I'm saying here is the federal government was basically saying, like, we'll support some mortgages, but not others. And for these neighborhoods, which were predominantly African-Americans, those folks couldn't buy houses, and and they weren't basically able to have houses underwritten by the federal government. So some people were able to have greater access to housing, and some people weren't. And this continued, quite dramatically after World War II, particularly when the federal government got in the business. There were extensions of this federal law and got into the business of underwriting mortgages, particularly in suburbs, areas that African Americans found it very difficult to buy homes. Up until the late 1940s, it was possible for neighborhoods to simply have basically restrictive covenants, where if you owned a house, a condition of signing a contract, a mortgage, would be that you would not sell that house to a person of color. So the Supreme Court struck that down in the 1940s, but there was still all kinds of resistance, social resistance from white homeowners to selling houses to African Americans in areas in which suburbs where it was really desirable to have houses. And so again, the federal government basically subsidized homeownership for whites. Another example of a policy that did this is the GI Bill, which probably a lot of people know something about, particularly if you have military families. And in the late 1940s and early 50s, the GI Bill subsidized housing loans for for millions of veterans. Because the GI Bill was administered locally, oftentimes white administrators, this was particularly the case in the South, but in other parts of the country as well, would simply, not underwrite loans for GIs and Black GIs in neighborhoods that were more desirable. So again, the important thing to recognize is that wealth builds over time. So again, going all the way back to the Civil War, this longer history of African Americans and other racial minorities as well, dealing from this, sort of place of having disadvantages in the marketplace, where there was still this fiction of it being a marketplace that was open and equitable to everyone, led to this instance in which, again, when wealth accrues over time, folks that are shut out early on, they just get further and further behind in the race. So, we've had policies over the past, 50 years that have removed a lot of the very specific impediments to inequities in housing. So probably a lot of people here know about the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1968. It was passed a couple weeks, actually, I think about a week after King was assassinated. It was one of his sort of final legacies. Which removed a lot of the barriers to housing discrimination. And there's been some revisions since that have, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more, that have, instructed other units of government to take more affirmative actions to make things more equitable. But we're still in a position in which these long-term legacies bear a lot on the marketplace now. And it's really important to recognize them if we're going to make, good decisions about how to rectify some of those barriers.
If I could interject a little bit there. First, there was a question in the chat about whether similar redlining maps exist for Green Bay. And the answer is similar maps exist for virtually every city in the nation. Redlining was common practice everywhere. So Green Bay is certainly not unique in that way, or Philadelphia, as the map showed, is not unique in that way. I just wanted to emphasize something Professor Shelton said. There have been some studies that estimate that as much as 80% of a family's wealth derives from transfers of money generation to generation, as opposed to savings accrued by any one generation in a family. These similar studies show that over a lifetime, whites' inheritances are on average 7 times larger than Blacks' inheritances are. And where does our wealth come from? What is the greatest source of money equity for most families in this nation? It's housing. The equity in one's home is typically the largest single asset anyone has, unless you're in like the top 1%. So this means a great deal. There have been other studies that show that among white families, monetary support typically flows from parents to their adult children It's far more common in Black families for monetary support to flow from adult children to their elderly parents who don't have the benefit of that built up equity, not just in one generation, but in multiple generations in advance. So it plays a huge factor in our ability to do things like get loans for education or small business startups if we don't have that kind of housing equity as collateral for those sorts of loans. And so having those racial disparities in homeownership and resulting wealth lead to disparities in virtually every other aspect of life. The other thing I need to say as someone who works for an agency that currently enforces fair housing law, including the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 that Professor Shelton referenced, is despite the fact that the Supreme Court struck down the ability of homeowners to have those racially restrictive covenants in the 40s, and despite the fact that we've had meaningful federal fair housing legislation since 1968, and here in Wisconsin, we actually had it even earlier. Our Wisconsin Open Housing Law was passed in 1965. So the organization I work for, the Fair Housing Council, enforces those laws. And I can tell you that despite the fact they're on the books, discrimination still runs rampant today. There's inadequate funding and public will to enforce those laws more meaningfully, frankly. There have been studies and investigations done all over the country that show that in the sales market alone, African Americans are treated differently than a white counterpart, anywhere from a quarter to nearly half the time. Asian Americans and Latinos face somewhat lower levels of discrimination according to these investigations, but it's still significant. And so we still need to fight the consequences of those historical barriers to housing and the barriers that are still being created in the here and now.
Yep. Yeah, I think, just to put a little more context, and I just threw up a link in the chat to the University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice project, which is a really great introduction to some of this stuff, especially, kind of ferreting out those racist restrictive covenants in real estate development. I mean, not only was the federal government involved in moving private investment away from some of our central cities and other places, but the private sector itself, did plenty of work to maintain these challenges with, less than 100 years ago, well, just over 100 years ago, I guess. The National Realtors Association were promoting as a professional practice, the necessity of ensuring that any new subdivision had these restrictive covenants in them to maintain the value of these properties and things like that. And this is just considered good business practice. And it's really been an evolution for us as a nation to understand that that's not good business practice. It's a terrible thing to be doing. And but the artifacts of it are still with us, as Erica and John are saying. I mean, it's created conditions that have ended up digging holes for huge segments of our populations that are going to take generations to get out of. And just a case in point, I've got some local data. If we look at 2000 census information, for example, less than 1 in 3 Black households own their own home. It was 32%, I think, and 38% of Latinos did, but 71% of white households owned a home. The overall rate of home ownership, 68.4%. I mean, I think shows us somewhat of the proportions of the population that folks were in. But if we fast forward to 2016 and just look at folks who purchased housing and this is, in Brown County. Although Black households trying to purchase homes were 3% of the overall population, they only account for less than half of 1% of the homes purchased that year. And yet whites who were 87.8% of the population, non-white Latinos or white non-Latinos, they accounted for over 91% of the home purchases. So I think we've got, if we just even looked at saying, hey, the people who are closing on homes were proportionate to the percentage of the population they account for, there would have been 150 more families buying houses that year that were from some of these traditionally excluded segments of our population, and that just that's just a little sample of, I think, the challenges that we've got to overcome.
Andrea, I wanted to touch a bit about what all three of the panelists just said, and connect this really interesting nugget. So I know people mentioned wealth, and I just want to make sure people understand why wealth is like such an important dynamic for us to discuss. So one, income is what you get. Most people get income from a job or services rendered, etc. That is how we both see that. Wealth is what you own minus what you owe, right? Wealth is stocks, bonds, housing, etc. Most people, the largest nugget of their wealth, which is over 80% of their wealth, is situated in the home that they own. If you are not a homeowner, the way that this economic system has been built, you are lacking wealth unless you have something attached to the employment that you have, such as 401ks. So, but wealth is a deciding factor for a number of things, from how long you can live, access to further higher education, 2-4 years in graduate, where you live, what your health status, the neighborhood that you occupy, the school's quality that's connected to you. All of the greatest determinant of the highest quality of all these factors, from living longer to what school you'll have access to the kind of healthcare you'll be provided, is often correlated with how much wealth you have. So if you don't have a home, either because of access-based issues or barriers created by the federal and state government or local government, you are actually moving away from the furthest nugget of what actually moves around economic mobility. The United States has one of the worst economic mobility matters in place, partly because we often talk about inequality from an income lens, which there are issues that happen on gender and race and location and region. But the truth is that one of the reasons that wealth is so insidious is because it feels very hidden. They often call it invisible capital, but it's actually the determinant of even how your children will get loans. And so what people do for wealth is they tap into wealth during times of detriment. So COVID is a great example. If you have a home that you can refinance, if you have other types of wealth, you're able to take work off, use that money to let your children, if you choose to have them, go to school, get lawyers, or take a less paying job, or if you're in a 2-parent household, have one parent stay home, or if you're in a single parent household and you have enough wealth, you might be able to use the equity from that not to have to work or take care of bills in a time that you can't do that. In a time where most of Americans are actually income insecure, if you have no wealth, it actually predetermines whether or not you can survive a pandemic, an economic downturn, and if your children will have an economic impact if you choose to do that. The other thing that's interesting about wealth that's very different than income, as John mentioned, is that it's intergenerational, meaning that it actually carries the history, the weight, and the policies of when that wealth was created, whether that is in the 19th century or the 21st. It actually carries the legacy of that, whether it gets, whether you get an income tax cut, whether or not you get a quote unquote death tax, whether or not you can put those funds into a foundation. All those things carry the weight of the public policies that created that wealth. So why that matters: when people of color and women were excluded from even having access to property, and at one time considered property themselves, they weren't able to have any of the length of time to accumulate wealth. So just to be a reminder, women were once considered property and couldn't own property until the 20th century. People of color particularly people who identify as Black, were actually considered slaves until much later. And we had Jim Crow up until the 1960s. And some of the fair housing stuff didn't go into place until the late 60s and 70s. And we're still dealing with the remedies of that. So these are all barriers, meaning that until almost the 21st century, marginalized people in this community country, including the majority of the population, even though they had minoritized status, actually didn't have access to the greatest wealth builder in the country. And just the fine point on that, John was talking specifically about the New Deal and where some of this started. The reason why we created mortgages to make housing more accessible is that previous to the legislation, you had to put 50% down on a home to own it. So homeownership was considered so exclusive that when people were returning from the war, they wanted to build more wealth in these neighborhoods and communities. And so the government realized very quickly that if we made housing more accessible, homeownership, that they could spread wealth, build jobs, and ultimately make people flourish. The plan worked, except they decided that women and people of color shouldn't be part of that plan. And so the weird part is that the US is actually brilliant at building wealth. Our problem is that we only want to build wealth for some people. And so what this conversation is about is like ensuring that we render the invisible visible, that there is wealth building opportunities for our communities to build the kind of communities they want, have the housing they need, to whether to rent to own, but our policies are insufficient. And even to this day in the 21st century, there are basic public policies around access to housing that still aren't remedied. And then as we start turning the corner and think about them from a lens of equity, we can start seeing what wealth will look like when it's equitized or equitable.
Fair.
If we really start getting a better sense of what wealth is, the history that created it, and the policies that worked, but just worked for the few and not the many.
Ahmad, a point you made about resilience and wealth, I think I've got a local example to follow that up in terms of our experience here in Green Bay. NeighborWorks Green Bay educates people about the home buying process. We teach them about the ins and outs of the real estate process and the mortgage market and things like that, and help them make smart decisions. And we found, even among extremely low income home buyers that we assisted, that prior to the recession, just over a decade ago, that even our most modest income buyers had rates of delinquency, default, and foreclosure in Brown County that were 7 times lower than conventional mortgagers, because of the preparation that they went through and the education that they got from our programs and the smart decisions they consequently made. And when the recessions, when the foreclosure crisis began, our clients weren't calling us. They weren't in a problem because they didn't make a bad decision. They didn't use some exotic mortgage. They didn't bet on being able to refinance after 6 months because of the appreciation of the house or some of the other things that caused that bubble to burst in a lot of markets. The modest income buyer in Green Bay didn't do that. The initial calls we got were investor owners who stretched themselves thin, who made some, who built a house of cards and it was coming down. And so we knew we had great success and we were on the right track. However, as the recession continued and then the jobs started going away and people started getting reductions in hours and things like that, then we started getting calls from some of our customers because they were stretched. They were stretched too far because they lost income. They didn't have the depth of wealth to draw on in that crisis. And at the end of the day, after the dust settled in the recession, some of those more lower income purchasers that we had helped, to buy homes, lost their homes at a slightly higher rate than conventional borrowers here in the county exactly because of that, because they didn't have the depth of resources that, that maybe all of us on this call are enjoying, and others in our community have had. So, that's the sort of thing that gets real, right? They made all the right decisions. They did all their homework. They saved money and put it down. They were stocking something aside as they could afford to, and they still lost their home. And that's the reality of it. We've got to work on that.
And no, I just want to put an even finer point on that. You're talking about the 2009 crisis where that was led by faulty mortgages that were of color, who had high credit, who had high income, who actually were formally educated. And what we saw in that foreclosure crisis, and we can get into that a different time, is that people trying to monetize the strongest asset, and which is connected to wealth, is housing. What they did is they actually took homeowners of color, even regardless of income, class, education, sold them faulty mortgages that made investors money, but that ultimately imploded on communities of color. And just to be clear, the wealth gap before that was for every dollar of white wealth was approximately 10 cents for communities of color. Just to make sure people understand that for every dollar of white wealth, that was only 10 cents, between 10 and 15 cents for communities of color. If you subdivide that into Latinos, First Peoples, First Nations, those vary a bit, but it's between 10 and 15 cents for every white dollar. We are now seeing, because of that recession, combined with these other elements, the greatest loss of wealth in a generation. And so I do have there's some.
And I yeah, an illustration of that point here. I think you can see this was, before and after that recession in terms of, and this is Wisconsin, it's from the Wisconsin Realtors Association. I'll put a link up to this report in the chat. But, it hit everybody, but it hit certain populations much harder. So even among white homeowners, there was a loss of homeownership, but among African Americans and Latinos, it was more significant, and there still hasn't been a recovery, of that. And I think if we look at this is national homeownership rates, we're just so far away from where we need to be. And I'll put a link up to this as well.
Great. This is really a helpful conversation. And you all on our panel, you're really fantastic. I'm really enjoying this. So let's talk a little bit about sort of biases when we're talking about housing and barriers that we're seeing both in home ownership and home purchasing, but also in developing affordable housing.
Well, I guess I can begin. Certainly, unlawful housing discrimination remains prevalent throughout Wisconsin. Individual home seekers, whether they're looking to make a purchase or to rent an apartment, frequently experience differences in treatment compared to a counterpart. So for instance, people of color experience what the law defines as misrepresentation of availability, where an African-American home seeker is told, oh, sorry, nothing's available until December, whereas a white home seeker is told, oh yeah, we have things available for November 1st. We still see in our investigations differences in treatment between home seekers, like people of color being quoted higher rental rates or higher down payment requirements or higher security deposits or extra fees compared to white home seekers. We still see some steering and segregation in the housing market, where home seekers of color are directed toward neighborhoods that are predominantly comprised of other people of color, whereas white home seekers are permitted to have a more varied range of housing opportunities that they choose. This is an intersectional issue, of course. It's not just about race and racial discrimination. At the Fair Housing Council, race-based complaints are the second most common type of complaint we take. Disability is the most common type of discrimination complaint we take. And third most common is discrimination based on familial status, simply pertaining to presence of children in a household. In terms of housing development, I think we still see in some communities, what we've come to know as NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, types of attitudes to new housing development. Sometimes when new multifamily or affordable housing developments are proposed, neighbors make facially neutral statements about, being in opposition to that new housing, claiming it will increase traffic or overload school districts with new enrollment or things like that. But sometimes that happens in coded ways that have to do with race. where a predominantly white community is opposing affordable housing development because they're concerned that it will bring an influx of people of color to what has historically been a predominantly white community. Sometimes it's not so coded. Sometimes people make outright comments at public hearings or city council meetings or things like that in opposition to that housing. And it is a real problem. I think effective public policy would help us analyze new development in light of a key question, which is, does this new development promote integration, or does it really just serve to shut down housing opportunities and reinforce the segregated housing patterns that already exist in our communities? And yet, I think that question is not frequently top of mind for public policymakers or developers, and it really needs to be if we're going to grow more equitable and expand housing choices for everyone.
Yeah, well said.
I would like to add something here if I could, if nobody else wants to talk at the moment. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is, and I agree with, I mean, Erica said that all so well. I guess one thing that I would challenge us to think about is, you know, we need to start thinking about housing as being a right? I mean, not something that, you know, we just remove barriers toward, which I agree, all that stuff's really good. I mean, and super important. But, you know, you think about public education, right? Like with public education, we don't just say, well, we're gonna basically prevent schools from discriminating against your kids, right? And hope you can find one, right? Like we ensure that everybody, they may not be perfect, but we ensure that every kid has a school to go to, and we have certain expectations for what those schools are going to be like. And if we're ever really going to solve this problem of, you know, creating an equitable society, and again, we have the aggregate wealth to do this. You know, we need to start. I mean, imagine if we constructed cities by thinking about ensuring that every person who lives there and works there and contributes to that city has the right to a safe and healthy place to live, right? And I'm not the policy wonk, so I don't know exactly what the policy is that does that. But to me, that's the perspective we need to take, right? And so if we do that, you know, that's how we really, I think, you know, move things forward in a way that gets somewhere close to ensuring that everybody has what they need to survive and thrive.
You know, John, I think that's a great point. And one of the challenges I think that comes from that is the you know, the mix of, we've got some government control, but that's in the form of zoning or planning and things like that. And it's really putting up signposts to the private developer market, whether or not there's subsidies involved in that or other, you know, things into that. There's also barriers in terms of regulatory hurdles and, you know, and the land use controls that we put in place and other things. But is that, you know, it's like we can have a vision, but then there's got to be an implementation. And one of the links I just posted, again, from that chart that showed the decline in homeownership rates since the recession is, you know, is this report that the Wisconsin Realtors Association did a couple of years ago that looks at, you know, kind of the gap between household formation and construction, you know, and I think a major part of this, and one of the reasons so many of the policies we've created as a nation have been set up to do what they've done, for good or bad, is to stimulate housing construction in different ways, because that is generally accepted by, you know, a number of economists, is that's the foundation of our, you know, economic engine in a lot of ways. And so we got to have housing starts, you know, we've got to have new construction. And if you look at Wisconsin's growth in new household formation in that study, they looked at like a 10 or 11 year period and found, you know, that we were many thousands of units short of building new dwelling units just to accommodate the net growth in household formation. So, and in, you know, in Brown County, I think they were looking at, you know, some 16 or 1700 units deficient over that study period in terms of, you know, new households formed or in the community relative to new housing built. And if we're, 2,000 units short and 100 units short every year of supporting, of providing units for people to live in, just physical units to live in, regardless of where they're at in the market. Who's going to win in the race to those units? Is it going to be the modest income person who's going to need, to jump through some hoops or maybe get some assistance from that local charity that helps families buy homes? Or is it going to be the person who's going to be able to put cash on the barrelhead and get the house bought? So we end up creating a situation where those folks who are less, competitive in the marketplace, i.e., the people of color and a number of other challenged individuals from the standpoint of maybe they've got a mobility limitation, disability, or some other barrier that's already there in their lives, poor credit, earning history, other things like that, they're going to lose. And then they're going to be forced to stay, in a rental market. The rental market's going to get denser. That's why we're seeing rents increasing in our community. That's why we're seeing housing prices go up. And then you get the builders building houses for the more affluent people because that's where the money is, and that they can make more margin there. And we just create this cycle that just keeps going. So, we can aspire to having policies and practices and plans that get us to where we see the right place to be, and that's a variety of housing choices at different price points, at a different 10 years ownership, rental, whatever, big yard, no yard, all those things. But until the government starts building them, in which they're not going to do, they're going to use it. They're going to use those tools to stimulate the market, or in some cases, like they do in partnership with our organization, they may make grants to us to help us build something that they want to see more of. We're not going to crack that nut, and so I think there's big challenges, I think, in terms of changing the minds of the world, because we can say, hey, let's build a more conventional downtowny feeling neighborhood out on the edges of the city where we got to build some new housing with sidewalks and some density and some neighborhood commercial uses and things like that. But then you're going to have everybody else who's got the large home or the big lot and the other things are going to say, no, that's going to lower our property values. We don't want that out there. And we're going to have the political will to do those things, because that's what we need to create, and we're just not there.
So no, I just want to add on.
That's the case.
And on that point, that I do really have to jump to help keep our democracy working. My thing is, I also think that there needs to be more involvement by regular people asking for their elected leaders to be more responsive to the vast variety of things that are encompassed by housing equity and racial justice and economic equality. And I think that we as advocates and leaders have often shied away from things that can actually be solved ironically. So I want to give the example of Green Bay. There is a lack of housing across every income spectrum.
Right.
There is room for us to be working with developers, affordable housing advocates, leaders, small businesses. And the truth is that we haven't asked for that kind of dynamic to come together where we actually can solve something, bring various parties together and reduce inequality in Green Bay. But that doesn't, a while ago, that just didn't seem possible, given the natural divisions that this moment has kind of thrust upon us. And so my both ask and demand and always my almost ridiculous optimism is that when we check in, when we start bringing the lens of equity and justice and willing to learn or bring our experience and our lived experiences to the policy making table and politics, that there are actual solutions that bring a variety of people together that can solve it. Green Bay is in an incredibly unique position, but we aren't the only place that could actually bring stakeholders across the spectrum, both politically and what we continue to assume are often different sides to the same problem. The truth is that everyone right now wants the same thing. And I think it's incumbent upon us to not only ask that of our elected leadership, but to plug in ourselves in spaces that we can and to talk about our lived experience, our expertise of what we need and what we want, and bring that to bear on our local, state, and federal government, because I think the possibilities are endless, particularly here in Brown County, and we just haven't asked for it. And I think doesn't mean there isn't resistance, but we can't say they haven't done it if we've never asked for it. I think I'm asking for our communities, our leaders to be more dynamic and asking for the world and the possibilities they want, And even when they say no, being more dynamic and thoughtful as we push them to a yes, because I think all of the ingredients there are for an equality cake, if you will, and we just got to get it moving. But have a great day, everyone. I do apologize I have to run. We just got to get this thing going for the city. Have a great, great, great day.
Yeah, and I would note too, just that the city's redevelopment authority has just received and accepted a new housing study that has a lot of really exciting proposals, particularly around removing regulatory barriers to affordable housing development, and there's some other things in there. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at that. There's a lot to digest there, so. But I'm going to try to find a link to that and put that in the chat as well. It might include the entire agenda from the last RDA meetings. I don't know if they've got a link to the document as a standalone yet, but good stuff.
So let's take a few minutes here at the end of our call to sort of bring this back to home. What are some of the resources and opportunities, the kinds of things that are cooking here in Green Bay to help solve some of these problems?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Fair Housing Council takes complaints of illegal housing discrimination, whether it's, again, in the rental market or sales or mortgage lending or homeowners insurance. And we can investigate allegations of discrimination for our clients, and we can assist people throughout the process of getting a legal remedy, so that, someone is holding a housing provider accountable when they've experienced a violation of the law. There are a lot of different routes that people take to achieve a legal remedy, but the Fair Housing Council supports people throughout those processes. Our website is fairhousingwisconsin.com. We have a toll-free statewide complaint intake line. One of the troubling issues we see with housing discrimination in this day and age is that it's often extremely subtle in the moment and hard for people to detect when they're experiencing it. So we urge people to call us, even if they're just experiencing the slightest concern or bad feeling in their gut that they've experienced discrimination. And we really see our role as helping people figure out whether or not what they experienced may be a violation of the law. So people should feel free to call us. Even if they're feeling very uncertain about a housing transaction and whether or not discrimination was part of it.
I would just, first of all, this has been really a fabulous conversation, and I've learned so much from this. So I just want to thank our other panelists today for allowing me to participate and engage. One thing I would say, and again, I'm not a housing expert locally, so I can't really say much there. But I want to just show everybody something else real quick, and this is from 1944. This is, can everybody see my screen? Okay. This is from a speech that FDR gave in January of 1944. And, I've obviously criticized the New Deal for really, being inequitable in some ways. But one of the really sort of powerful things about the moment from the 1930s to the 1950s was this idea that government should play the role of ensuring, basically ensuring that people's lives got better, right? Ensuring that their lives were more secure. And so one of the things that FDR proposed in 1944 was a second Bill of Rights, right? The first Bill of Rights is freedom of speech, freedom of press, right? These things that protect us from government incursion. But, what FDR talked about was, this list of new things that would enhance people's lives: the right to a job, the right to food and clothing, the right to be free from monopolies for small business owners. And, one of those rights was the right of every family to a decent home. And, again, I think there's a lot of things, there are a lot of constraints on local governments. I do agree with Ahmad that there are things that we can be doing locally. Can't do everything locally, right? And long term, I think if we're going to have a government that actually, really takes it to heart to work to make everyone's lives better in meaningful ways. That means that we're all going to have to get more involved politically. But again, I would challenge everybody who's listening this to take this to heart and think about what it would mean to construct a society in which we didn't allow people to not have a decent home, right? We said you have the right to a decent home, and really put that at the center of our policies. And maybe we don't always get there, but that's what we aspire to. I'm guessing my other panelists here agree with me on this point. But I want to challenge everybody else who's watching this to think about that moving forward and basically demand that from our politicians. That's the kind of society we should be constructing. So I'll just leave my pitch there, and yeah, thank you.
Great.
I'll just note that I dropped some information about the Fair Housing Council in the chat, including our website and a toll-free statewide complaint intake number, as well as a link to a new free app we have that people can use during a housing search. It's designed for a rental housing search specifically. I'll also mention the Fair Housing Council has staff who conduct fair housing presentations and trainings. For anyone interested in the topic, social service agencies or faith-based groups or college classes. Professor Shelton, I might be contacting you to talk about how we can partner in the future. But I think I do speak for everyone here. I know we relish being contacted by the community. We hope you understand us as a community resource. So thank you again to the YWCA for convening this group.
Yeah. I would echo those comments and think that it is, as John is saying, and I think he's creating a great aspiration for us as a community to envision that future where everybody has got housing. I mean, we've talked a lot about barriers to housing that are economic or are class-based or just artifacts of past bad decisions by our forebears and others. But we haven't even really touched on the challenges of homelessness in the community or other vulnerabilities that are, probably whole seminars or webinars in themselves to talk about some of those dynamics. But if everybody had a place to live, that would be, that'd be a great that they could afford. It was sustainable for them and had the prospect of, them building equity and ultimately wealth if that was what was their goal. I think, setting those goals, thinking about those things are part of what we need to look at, and that brings in a whole other host of organizations and opportunities from just regular education in the school systems to financial literacy training to the life skills that need to be had and maybe even more carefully practiced when you're in a more vulnerable state to begin with. And then all of that working with a community that actually wants to embrace the other and encourage them to be their neighbors. And I think that's the work that we've got before us, and we can get there.
So John, Noel, Erica, and Ahmad out there in the universe, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this kind of hot topic. And to all of you out there viewing, thank you so much for joining us today. And also thank you so much for your participation in the chat and the Q&A boxes. We've got quite a few questions, both that we had thought of before this webinar that we haven't touched on, and we've had some really good questions in the Q&A that we haven't had a chance to touch on. So I'm going to commit to doing some behind the scenes work and see if we can pull together some additional kind of opportunities for us to explore this topic, because there's clearly a lot of a lot of interest and a lot of really good questions out there from all of our viewers. So thank you all for participating in this as well, and giving us this kind of motivation to be able to keep exploring this topic. So thank you all for that. Oh,
I'm sorry, Andrea, can we commit to trying to answer these questions and sending that out, maybe along with the links that we've posted in chat to the registered participants of this?
yes, we definitely can. And I have those questions written down. So we'll be able to get some of that moving. So thank you all so much. And from YWCA Greater Green Bay, thank you so much for joining us in our mission today to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We've got more series coming up here for the Stand Against Racism monthly. So if you check out our website or our social media, you'll be able to find registration links for our additional webinars coming up throughout the course of the year as well. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to all of you out there in the universe watching. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Take care, everybody.